my stepmother do a lot of work in the stock market. My stepmother was actually in an article in Money Magazine some years ago as a woman investor in the stock market. And they asked me to do some calculations for things in the stock market that they couldn't get a handle on using the typical software like Thinkorswim or anything like that. They'll show you all the charts. They'll show you all kinds of graphs about what the stock did and so on and so forth. But one thing you got to recognize in the stock market is that it's influenced by outside events as opposed to a coin flipping or poker, blackjack type game where I call it risk, right? Because you pre-calculate the odds and come up with a strategy. In the stock market, you can't do that. It's not predictable in the same way as the other types of games are, so I qualify it as a gamble, not merely a risk. Right? So I was looking for something. My father wanted to do a specific calculation. He wanted to know and keep track of things like, well, what did the stock market do from yesterday to today? Well, just that's a difference. And I said, well, what did it do from a couple of days ago, yesterday, and today? He wanted to know, is it going up like this? Is it curving over like this? Is it more flat? Is it going down? Is it down, but is it coming back up? So you don't merely measure the first derivative, or the slope. The thing that tells you its curvature is called the second derivative. So I had to kind of figure out a way to calculate some of this stuff. So I went online and I did a Google search for the most obvious thing I could come up with was ruby gem stocks. Is there any ruby gems that work with stocks? And I looked at a couple of them, and some of these weren't too bad. And I focused on the Yahoo one because I found that it appeared to be a pretty simplistic result. The idea is that you just go ahead and do a gem install for this Yahoo Finance item. And then after you do that, you can then get these stock quotes using this form here. And then, for example, this just illustrates using the get quotes command, and then you go ahead and just put out a particular symbol to a string. Right? So what I decided is I would look at the documentation in a little bit more detail here and see what they give you. And what they give you is they give you an array. So it's a particular Ruby data type. Well, what do you do with an array? Well, normally you take elements of the array and you process with those. So, for example, if you want to know the close element of the array, that's element of the array in brackets 4 to take the closed data. So that's what he was interested in primarily. So what I did is I went in and put in to interactive Ruby, just this little snippet with a particular piece of information, just to see what it looks like. All right, and I started from there. So using IRB enabled me to put the data out in a useful format. So the one piece of information that's in that website was called the Yahoo Finance : get historical close days with stock, and then some number of days that you're going to ask for. So I figured, well, you might as well start with something like 30 days, so you can make a graph illustrating its behavior over the past month. Now, stocks only trade 5 days a week unless there's a holiday, in which case they might trade only 4 days a week, right, for example. So the amount of data that you get in 30 days is not actually 30 items. So it'll vary depending on what time interval you're working in. But I figured it would be a good start just to set it at 30 days. So what I did is I set up an empty array for my data. It's just set to an empty array. The velocity is the first derivative. That's how it's trending. And I set that to be an empty array. And because I had a little foresight into the data structure of the acceleration, I set it to be an array whose initial element is 0.0. And the reason for that is that you're not going to have as much data in the array for acceleration because of the way it's calculated. You lose the ends because of the way that the acceleration is computed. So then I created a little routine which let me calculate the difference of a value in an array at a particular index. I chose it to be the array calculated at index plus 1 minus the array at index. And then this little diff routine is actually the first derivative. In calculus, it would be called the first derivative. And this is my velocity. Right? So what I ask the user to do in interactive Ruby is just to do a puts, enter the name of stock, such as MSFT, because that's the stock symbol for Microsoft. You could use any one that you like, it doesn't really matter. And then I do stock equals gets.chump, so gets takes input from the terminal and it terminates it after I hit enter. So now I've actually got something in the value for stock based on what the user input, and I've got something on size based on the initial value that I assigned it up here at the top of 30. Right? So I go ahead and I run this Yahoo Finance item. I get the stock quote for a certain number of days, and I do for each row in the array. Now this is actually giving me not just a single array, it's giving me an array of arrays, right, that I have the information here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the fourth element of each row that's in there, the item bracket that it supports, actually the fifth element of the array. And I'm going to convert that from the format that it's in, which is a string. I convert it to 2F, so it's a floating point number. Then I'm going to concatenate that on the end of the data. Right? So what I'm doing is, the first thing I'm doing is I'm creating the data array from the quotation they give you. Right? I then actually redetermine the size by taking the count of what's in that data, because it might only be 20-something depending on how many holidays or non-trading days for any reason were in that interval. Right? Now I got to go ahead and calculate the velocity and the acceleration. The size that I have to calculate is I do a list from 0 to size minus 2 elements, because what's going to be in the velocity, I'm going to just put 0 at the end, so I only need to go to size minus 2. And I take the I take that program diff, I take the data array, comma I, and this actually calculates the data at I plus 1 minus the data at I. So this is just calculating the first difference. And I'm going to stuff that into this array called vel. Then when I'm done with what's in there, I just tack an extra 0 on the end, because you can't calculate easily at the end. So now I've got a velocity array. Then I go ahead and calculate the acceleration array. This one only goes from 0 to size minus 3, and the reason for that is because I already prepended a 0 at the beginning of the acceleration array, and I'm going to postpend another 0 at the end of the acceleration array. And this is actually going to calculate the second derivative. The formula that's commented out here is a standard numerical differencing formula that you would use for a second derivative. But you can just calculate it as the diff of the data at I plus 1 minus the diff of the data at I. It's the same thing. The information is then stuffed into these two new arrays from the original data array. So at the end, what I do is I do a csv.open, and I use string interpolation for the name of the stock, .csv, and I write to it, and I do for the information that's in there, I take the data, the velocity, and the acceleration, I put them into this particular file, which is now a CSV file. From the CSV file, I was hoping I could then do a calculation using like one of the GNU programs to do the plotting. I tried it, I got terrible results. It only gave me a character graph, and it looked absolutely horrible. So what I decided to do after I got this far was, well, it's a CSV file. I can always open it up in Excel. Excel or Open Office calc program will take your CSV file, and it'll convert it to just be the entries in the rows. Right? You can then go ahead and just pick another location in there and tell it to insert a graph of a particular type, like a line graph, using the data that you select. So then it becomes very simple to actually get a graphical analysis of what you've got. So once I have this in place, I then go ahead and run IRB, and I pick my file here is called yahoo.rb, and I run it, and it goes ahead and it asks me to enter the name of the stock. Well, it suggests MSFT. Let's go ahead and type in MSFT. And you see it spits out a bunch of information, and there's the velocity array. Here's the acceleration array down here, and then it goes ahead and it writes the information out to this MSFT.CSV. So if I do more on MSFT.CSV, okay, here is actually a comma-separated value data, and the first row is the stock price, the second row from here down to here is the velocity, and starting here we have the acceleration ending over here. Right? So now that I've actually got something there, I would actually go ahead and run a program that does work with the CSV file. So we have installed here. Let's see, I think I have Office on this one. So go to Office Calc. And my other machine where I originally developed, and I happened to have Excel, so I did it in Excel first. But it'll work, it should work the same way. And do a file open. And then we're going to go into the folder where I installed the Ruby on Rails installer here. All right, so here's MSFT.CSV. Let's see if that'll work. Okay, so there we go. Right, so it opens it up in Excel.
It didn't split it up.
Did you have the wrong options checked on it?
Oh, it doesn't matter?
Yeah. Yeah, you have everything in basically 3 cells. Is that what I should check?
There was a dialog where you can check comments.
Oh, I didn't notice. All right. File, open. Let's try that again.
Yes, you have to
You have to close it first.
You have to do import. It's under tools.
Yeah.
Just close it.
Close it, reopen it.
Yeah.
All right, I'll do it.
Yeah.
Let's try it that way. Look it off. Where are you?
What's the glue
Okay, so
Comma down, yeah, in the middle, separate the
And take out the other ones.
Oh, separated by.
by a comma.
Yeah, there you go.
This window actually shows you a preview below, but I guess it's a little zoom. The resolution is too small.
All right. All right, so there it goes. Now it's got an element in every cell. Okay, that's what we're looking for. Very good. All right. So now we can just click somewhere else and say insert. Let's see here. We got a graph in here, or am I off my edge now because of this stupid shrinking? Insert.
Yeah, you can't see all the
It
items.
looks like
in that menu.
you're trying to hide your taskbar, but it's not succeeding.
Yeah, because once it's shrunk, it doesn't seem to do it.
There's the icon next to the sorting.
If you disable the hiding, it'll at least not cover it for you.
All right, let's see if we change the size here. All right, let's see if we change the size.
Are you close to the little graph down the floor?
Graph.
I think that's right.
just underneath how.
Here we go, there's a chart.
Prediction.
And then,
Oh, God.
okay,
I resigned.
I need a line, points and lines. Let's see if we can figure out where to get it from.
So coding Kata on how to plot SCSV.
If you want to turn it into a canoe plot, coding Kata.
Well, I tried, but trust me, I had a heck of a time trying
Yeah, I
to.
think it's also the space versus common.
Yeah.
You probably have to spread out the tablet a bit.
Bit expensive.
I think it would also want the data in rows instead of
Anyhow,
Yeah, all right. Well, it obviously worked better in Excel, obviously, compared to this, but the idea was that it enabled my father to see what he was looking to see. So let's go ahead and look at the code again and see if we can improve it. We can discard that. And see ways that we can improve the code. Now, my first approach to improving the code actually was from the original calculating data at I plus 1 minus data at I, and realizing that I needed to do that again for the acceleration. That's why I created the function diff in order to sort of essentially reuse the code. It also makes some of the differences smaller. If you're calculating the differences of smaller numbers, you might actually get a little bit more significance in your data rather than try and calculate the value down here. It might lose some significance if you had big swings when the stock market is going haywire. So I tried that. The other things we could do is instead of doing for I in, what are some of the other idioms that we would normally use? We would say, instead of this piece of code, would you say something like 0, dot, dot, size minus 2, dot, each, for example, to do essentially the same thing. Let's take a look and see.
Since you're building an array using it, you could do dot collect, but
Right.
you say that later.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's not just one path to improving this, all right? So each, and then it's the format, just vertical bars and then I.
Do first. Each space do, and then
Each, right, and then do, and then do I need a brace here? Oh, this will do it for the one layer.
You also think about that parentheses,
I'm sorry?
the range, otherwise you're calling each method on.
So what do I need to brace?
Rest there.
Close the
close parameter,
and open paren at the beginning. Is it actually a paren or a brace?
Paren.
Okay, so fix that up. All right, so like that. So that's why I felt that was actually less elegant because of the extra braces required, but it should end up the same way, and it should still function. So you go ahead and save it, and you run it. I will pick Google for the stock this time. It goes ahead and does the same type of calculation. And if you do more on do.csv, right, you again get the data in the first row, the velocity in the second row, and the acceleration in the third row. So there's undoubtedly, a lot fancier stuff you do it. And one of the things I thought was, you could write a loop around this, which would take a set of stocks instead of just one stock, so you can actually generate, spit them all out. You can still write it so that you can go ahead and do the CSV to open each CSV file using the name of the stock and just generate them all in one shot. That looks like a non-trivially tougher one for me though, since that's going to require more control structure. But what I found very helpful is just that compared to some of the other gems that were out there doing stock finance, the Yahoo one seemed to be particularly simplistic in that the data structure came out as an array of arrays, making it much easier. It wasn't JSON or anything else where I would have to scratch my head and try and figure out how to deal with it. This came out, for me, in basically the simplest possible way it was constructed. Right. So starting from nothing, I was able to generate, this basic code in about an hour and a half, never having done anything, with any of this type of stuff previously. So I was actually pretty impressed how straightforward it was to do compared to other languages where you might have tried mightily to fight the structure that you had imposed on you. So, anybody have any other questions or comments?
Well, yeah, I think let's open it up for just feedback on the code and the presentation and all that. That sounds great.
Yeah, I think that you should reconsider the way that you're constructing your CSV files to instead of having just 3 rows to actually iterate through each of your days as numerical values of that. So you have 3 columns instead. That way, whenever you're not just talking about 30 days, you're talking maybe 365 days. You don't have this increasing amount of columns to and then don't have your graphic problems.
Oh, well, the graphic problem, I think, is specific to the open office. I had no trouble.
But readability also.
Yeah.
That's also the format it needs to be approved as well.
You can also try this. I noticed there was a Ruby binding for R, and you could pipe it straight into R and use that to go in plots and everything, and that would probably.
There are a couple different tools, but if you're not familiar with how they work, what you do.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think it's probably a lot of extra overhead. I mean, not that you really manage to dump it into CSV and back, and you could also probably calculate some of these things, like flatten the loops, not have to do multiple loops. I don't know.
So the one change that I would suggest, which I saw right off, is the acceleration is the delta of the velocities.
Right.
Right, but you're not actually doing that. You're recalculating the 2 velocities and then delta in them. Right? So you could actually change the ACC gets diff minus diff to ACC gets diff velocity of I.
Well, the only issue I would have there is whether or not it was properly centered, because the acceleration is calculated from 3 data points and the velocity only from 2. So technically the velocity isn't properly centered because it's actually evaluating at the half point, in essence, when you look at how it's actually done. But since the thing is off by 1, that's why I added the zeros at the end for the acceleration to avoid that issue. I certainly could take diff of vel comma I.
Well, what I was saying is if the velocity is diff of data I at each point, okay, then diff of data I plus 1 is 1 ahead of the velocity of I.
Yes, I could do it
right.
like this.
So
Yeah.
So that is exactly the same thing as what you were doing before.
Yeah.
It's the delta of the velocity.
Yeah, that's perfectly reasonable. It won't make any difference in terms of the significance or anything like that. The numbers aren't that small to worry about. So that'll look fine too. As long as the only issue here would be that
You have to change the size to -2. Because now you're stepping through the velocities, not through the data.
right.
So back to size -2.
Yeah. Right. So that'll work too.
Anybody have any other feedback?
For any other questions on how to generate this stuff from scratch, I mean, basically, the other things I tried was, I tried using like Google Plot and the new plot, and the Google Plot just kept getting worse and worse. And the new plot, the only thing I could end up with was like a character plot, which was useless. It looked better in Excel by far. Let's put it that way.
I have some feedback. I would have loved to have seen you write code as opposed to just review it. And as you're writing it, talk to us about the thought process. I think that would have been really good. I mean, even
You know how bad a typist I really am?
But for people doing katas in the future, I mean, it's totally acceptable to print out your code, right, and have that as a backup, so to speak, if you're uncomfortable with getting up in front of people and doing it live. It is tough, but I think that there's so much value in watching somebody just even type out and kind of step through and stub their toe a little bit. And we didn't get any of that right now because we kind of just had a code review which is, you know, there's still obviously value in receiving code, but I would have loved to see you type each line, you know, and explain it as you go, and kind of basically compact that process that you learned in that hour and a half, or however long it was, into a half hour. You know what I mean? And maybe cherry pick some of the lessons you learned. You know, make a mistake on purpose. I don't know. Any of that stuff.
Just two little things in case you didn't know. You can run Ruby programs, just type Ruby and a space, the name of the program. You don't have to run them in IRB. Were you doing it in IRB just so you could see all the...
Well, yeah, I wanted to actually look and see what the results were in case there was some obvious boner from you know, the calculation, like if I multiplied instead of subtracted.
Okay, so it's kind of like a debug term.
Yeah, for me,
all right.
you know, it was just convenient.
And then the other thing is the indentation you're using is kind of weird, and I think it's even inconsistent with itself because of where the ends end up being and how you're using different amounts of indentation in different places. I recommend looking at other Ruby code and trying to get an idea of what kind of style you want to follow and sticking with that. But for just for a small project, it's totally fine. Maybe use RuboCop. What does RuboCop tell you about indentation?
Yeah, Will, you can actually have it pick out things. It'll actually use the Ruby style guide, which will
that's cool.
All right.
which will complain about almost all of your code.
It's your last end. You'll be like, okay, part of some text.
Thanks, Leo.